Gloria Martínez Ruiz was born on January 29, 1975, in Alicante. To understand who she was before tragedy erased her, it is necessary to move away from the image of the victim and see the adolescent. Gloria was not a girl with a behavioral disorder. She was a brilliant student in her senior year at the Bahia de Babel Institute. Her life was marked by a very high level of personal demand. At home, she lived with her father, Alvaro Martínez Martínez, a primary school teacher at the Virgen del Rosario School, her mother, Isabel Ruiz, a homemaker, and her younger sister, Maria Jose. Gloria's musical side was, perhaps, the point where her personality could be best read. She was a dedicated pianist. The conservatory was not a hobby, it was an extension of her discipline. This dedication to the piano, added to her need to meet high family expectations, created a fertile ground for what psychologists call high-performance stress in adolescence. In my opinion, it is possible that Gloria was a young woman with emotional intelligence far superior to the average, but without the necessary tools to manage failure or frustration, which led her to turn her self-demand into a self-defense mechanism. The decline was not sudden, but a gradual erosion. It began with insomnia. It was not a simple problem falling asleep, it was a state of permanent alertness. Gloria would get up at night, unable to shut down her mind, walking around the house. Her parents, worried, began to notice that their daughter's character was changing. She became more withdrawn and food became a battlefield. The anorexia did not appear as a search for aesthetics, but as a form of control when the rest of her world, studies, pressure, insomnia, seemed to run wild. Seeking a solution, the family contacted Dr. Maria Victoria Soler de la Fuente, a psychiatrist based in Alicante who enjoyed a very particular reputation. The choice was a decision driven by the parents' fear of medicalization. Dr. Soler presented herself as a professional who avoided aggressive drugs, betting on personal treatment and talk therapy. For a family that saw their daughter as someone normal, who just needed a push, this approach was a bomb. At first, what usually happens in these cases occurred: an artificial improvement. The support environment and the doctor's treatment seemed to work. Gloria improved enough to be discharged. But relapses in the processes of adolescent anorexia and depression are, regrettably, frequent. When the insomnia and the rejection of food returned, Gloria's fragility became evident. Here, a fundamental turning point appears: the proposal for group therapy. Gloria refused point blank. In my opinion, this refusal should not be interpreted as a lack of cooperation, but as an alarm signal from an adolescent who felt exposed and vulnerable. For a girl as sensitive to the judgment of others as Gloria, group therapy was probably a threat, not a help. Dr. Soler's change in attitude after this refusal was drastic. It is here that the psychiatrist, instead of adapting the therapy, seems to have lost patience or professional ethics. Without warning and without a history of prior medication, she began administering haloperidol. As an analyst of this case, I find this clinically incomprehensible. Moving from talk therapy to a major antipsychotic without a diagnosis of severe psychosis is a leap that, under any medical standard, raises serious suspicions of malpractice. When Gloria's father confronted her about this use of chemistry, the doctor stonewalled, marking the beginning of the end of the doctor-patient relationship based on trust and beginning the era of coercion. Dr. Soler de la Fuente intensified her pressure on Gloria's parents. The strategy shifted from medication to institutionalization. The doctor began to insist that Gloria needed admission to a private clinic she trusted, Torres de San Luis, located in Alphas del Pi. The parents, at first, opposed it firmly. They saw the internment as a disproportionate measure, a step that they felt would stigmatize their daughter and distance her from her natural environment, which was the only thing that seemed to keep her connected to her previous life. Dr. Soler then used emotional blackmail as a clinical tool. She threatened the family that if they did not proceed with admission under her conditions, she would wash her hands of the case entirely. For parents who had already placed all their trust in her and who lived with the constant fear that their daughter would get worse, this threat was devastating. It was coercion disguised as medical advice. The parents, cornered by fear and the lack of alternatives, agreed to what, deep down, Gloria did not want. The Torres de San Luis clinic, owned by the company Zopito S.A., was not the sanctuary of health the doctor described. It was, in reality, a financial powder keg. The center was mired in an unsustainable technical bankruptcy. Suppliers refused to provide products due to non-payment. Staff salaries, doctors, nurses, cleaners, had months of delays, and the building's infrastructure was barely maintained. The clinic did not operate under medical criteria, but under business survival criteria. They needed patients who paid to be able to sustain a structure that was already dead. On October 29, 1992, the parents took Gloria to Alphas del Pi. The cost of admission was set at 30,000 pesetas per day, a figure that the family had to obtain by resorting to other relatives, as their economic situation was not buoyant. The atmosphere in the clinic was desolate. Upon entering, Gloria did not find a multidisciplinary medical team, but an almost empty building, a shell that was falling to pieces. For practical purposes, Gloria was the only patient admitted, which made her the only real livelihood of the clinic. The management of the center was surreal. Dr. Soler, who was the one who supposedly directed the treatment, was not there. She managed the clinic by phone from Alicante, dictating orders without having seen the patient, without evaluating her state in real time, and without having a direct vision of her evolution. Gloria was placed under the care of an auxiliary nurse and a nursing assistant who, like the rest of the staff, worked in a climate of demotivation and fear of the center's closure. Gloria's admission was not an act of medical care. It was a handover to a system that was not prepared to manage an adolescent with anorexia, but to invoice for her stay. The parents, in leaving their daughter, were handing her over to a clinic that did not have enough staff, that did not have economic solvency, and that, above all, did not have the minimum required face-to-face medical supervision. From that moment on, Gloria ceased to be a patient to become a hostage of a structure that desperately needed her not to leave so it could continue charging those 30,000 pesetas per day. The trap was closed. Within the walls of Torres de San Luis, Gloria's life became a spiral of negligence. On October 30, 1992, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Gloria, feeling trapped in a place she perceived as hostile and desolate, began to show signs of agitation. Instead of offering her emotional containment, the clinic's response was to apply a draconian chemical regime. Dr. Solar, without having set foot in the center, ordered by telephone the administration of a cocktail of drugs of excessive potency. Haloperidol, an antipsychotic with very aggressive side effects such as deep sedation, muscle rigidity, and mental confusion, was the central axis of this treatment. But it was not the only thing. She was supplied with a combination of 3 other drugs whose names and doses were never recorded in the official medical history. This absence of records is, under any forensic standard, irrefutable proof of malpractice. A hospital does not forget to note a patient's medication, unless there is a deliberate intention to hide the use of unauthorized substances or experimental doses. The nursing staff, composed of an auxiliary nurse and an assistant, found themselves in an impossible position. Rina Castellucci, the nurse on duty, recorded years later the pressure she was under. According to her testimony, the doctor ordered by phone doses that she considered incompatible with the life of a 17-year-old girl with low weight. Rina refused on several occasions to apply what she considered an overdose prescribed from a distance, which shows that inside the clinic there existed an internal struggle between the professional ethics of the base staff and the telephone tyranny of a doctor who, in my opinion, was prioritizing the chemical control of the patient over any other medical consideration. To ensure that Gloria did not interfere with the clinic's logistics, she was immobilized in her bed using restraint straps. Gloria spent the hours tied up, in an induced state of stupor, unable to defend herself from the devastating effects of a chemical cocktail that was annulling her basic cognitive functions. The horror of her captivity becomes tangible in a detail that is chilling for its humanity. A note that Gloria left written with a trembling hand, almost illegible due to the effect of the drugs. "I am afraid to think that I am dying and the only light is near me. My God." That note is the final testimony of an adolescent who knew, with terrifying lucidity, that she was not in a hospital, but in a place where her life had ceased to be important. The figure of the center's cook rises as the only beacon of mercy in this story. She was the only person who, during lunch, treated Gloria as a human being and not as a commodity that had to be contained. She helped her ingest her food while watching, with horror, how the restraint straps hung empty from the young woman's wrists, ready to be adjusted again as soon as she finished eating. The cook saw in Gloria's eyes not a disease, but a visceral fear. The fear of someone who is being physically destroyed by the environment in which she finds herself. Gloria did not fear her anorexia. She feared the white coats and the straps that dictated her hours. At 1:30 in the morning on October 30, 1992, normalcy, or what was left of it, at the Torres de San Luis clinic was broken forever. The nursing staff entered a state of alarm, or at least that was what they tried to project to the investigators. The version of events they presented to the authorities upon their arrival was a script so implausible that, from the very first moment, it raised suspicions of being a fabricated construction. The story they told was the following. Gloria, in a state of uncontrollable agitation, had managed to break free from the straps, struggled with the staff, ran toward a window, jumped to the exterior, and, not satisfied with that, climbed and overcame a perimeter fence wall of the estate more than 2 meters high to disappear into the darkness of the night. For any investigator, the technical analysis of this escape is a logic exercise that crumbles the lie in a matter of seconds. Let us dissect the points of this physical impossibility. Gloria suffered from severe myopia of 8 diopters. Without her glasses, which were found in her room, her vision was reduced to blurred spots. In the darkness of the night, a person with this condition is functionally blind. The idea that she could orient herself, avoid obstacles, and find an exit route in unknown terrain is, simply put, a physical impossibility. Gloria was under the effects of a cocktail of haloperidol and other potent psychotropics administered hours earlier. These drugs act on the central nervous system, causing muscle rigidity, disorientation, and a severe reduction of motor coordination. Pretending that someone under these conditions could perform a high-demand physical maneuver, such as jumping a 2-meter wall, is an affront to any basic knowledge of pharmacology. The most devastating detail in the summary is that the window through which, according to the staff, Gloria had escaped, was found by the civil guard locked from the inside. In a closed room, sealed from the inside, it is physically impossible for a person to have exited through that access point. If someone exits through a window, it does not mechanically close after their passage. That was not an exit route, It was a room that contained a secret that the clinic staff wanted to keep at all costs away from external gazes. When the agents arrived, they found the clinic staff in a state of absolute nervousness. They were not acting like professionals who had just lost a patient. They were acting like people who had committed a catastrophic error and were desperately trying to coordinate a lie. They contradicted each other in distances, in times, and in the chronology of the supposed struggle. The accounts were learned, not lived. Based on the insurmountable contradiction of the locked window, there was no escape. The clinic was facing a sudden death of its only patient, probably due to the adverse reaction to the clandestine medication, and the staff panicked. They realized that Gloria's death in that center, in bankruptcy and without supervision, would mean the immediate closure of the clinic and legal consequences for all those present. They decided, in an act of extreme cowardice, to get rid of the body and create a story of an escape that would allow them to gain time. The clinic searched for Gloria with sticks, shouting her name, in a theater of desperation that only served to justify their own negligence. If a patient with 8 diopters and doped had jumped a wall, she would have left traces, remains of clothing, or signs of having suffered a fall. There was nothing. The truth is that Gloria Martínez Ruiz never walked out of that room on her own feet. After the night of the supposed escape, the cruelest period began for the Martínez Ruiz family, the search in the void. 4 weeks, and then months, Gloria's father and mother became investigators of their own tragedy, facing a wall of silence, negligence, and bureaucracy by those responsible for Torres de San Luis, and, at times, by the paralysis of the local authorities themselves. On July 19, 1993, the case hit rock bottom regarding the degradation of human dignity. At the insistence of the parents, a search was organized in the landfills of La Nucia, a place where, according to certain information of dubious origin, Gloria's body could have ended up. Seeing parents have to authorize and witness the search of tons of trash in search of their daughter's remains is an image that defines the absolute dehumanization of this case. The words of Alvaro Martinez, the father, before the media that day, continue to resonate with a bitterness difficult to describe. "I hope and wish that my daughter does not appear there, but it is a possibility and we have the obligation to check it." They found nothing, which, ironically, meant an even greater form of torture, uncertainty. But time, although sometimes it buries the evidence, also erodes lies. Years after the clinic closed, when the building was already abandoned and the case seemed condemned to archived oblivion, a finding appeared that crumbled any theory of voluntary escape. In the center's garage, hidden under rubble and remains of clinical activity, Gloria's clothing was found. If Gloria had escaped voluntarily, as the clinic maintained, why was her clothing, which she would have needed to survive outside, still kept there? That find was the definitive proof that the clinic was not the starting point of an escape, but the end point of her existence. The fact that her clothing was hidden in the garage is material, almost physical proof that someone with access to the keys and control of the building, was in charge of cleaning the room and hiding her belongings to avoid them being linked to a possible crime scene. It was an attempt to erase the trail of a person who, for those responsible for Torres de San Luis, had become a logistical problem to solve. The clinic closed its doors shortly after the event, not due to a process of improvement, but due to financial collapse and the pressure of the scandal. Upon closing, the building was dismantled. With the demolition of the structure, the tracks, the biological remains that could have been left in the room, and any other evidence that a modern criminalistics team would have found in a matter of hours were erased. The Spanish justice system of that time, overwhelmed and, in my analysis, sadly disinterested in a case that did not have the media visibility of others, allowed this dismantling to occur almost without supervision. Gloria did not go anywhere. She was erased. And those who had the power to prevent it, those who had the key to the room where the negligence occurred, were in charge of ensuring that a response was never found. The search in the landfills was not just a search for a body. It was a process of systematic humiliation for a family that only asked for the truth. To conclude this file, we must address why Gloria Martínez Ruiz ended up being an invisible victim. Gloria's case was not a lost case due to lack of evidence, but a case that was deliberately buried by an asphyxiating social and media context. Spain in 1992 was not prepared to manage the tragedy. The population lived in a state of hyper-alert. The succession of crimes, Marta Maria Obregon in Burgos, Olga Sangrador in Valladolid, Leticia Labrado, Maria del Carmen Rivas in Lugo, had created compassion fatigue. When so many atrocious events occur in such a short span, society's ability to process pain is blocked. Gloria's case, a disappearance in a mental health center, was too complex, too technical, and above all, too uncomfortable to be digested by a public opinion that preferred to focus on the archetype of the monster on the road. On November 13, 1992, barely 2 weeks after Gloria's disappearance, the Alcácer tragedy occurred. The disappearance and subsequent discovery of Miriam, Tony, and Desiree absorbed all the media, political, and police attention of the country. The eclipse effect was total. Gloria's case was sucked in by the magnitude of Alcácer. All resources, all headlines, and all eyes in the country shifted toward Valencia. While the whole country was looking for the girls of Alcácer, Gloria's trail was cooling in the rubble of a clinic that was already being dismantled. Justice in this case was a succession of shelving. No one was convicted for the negligence, no one answered for the lethal doses, and no one was charged for the farsa of the escape. Those responsible for Torres de San Luis simply disappeared into the business fabric, protected by the passage of time and the lack of a judicial impulse that would connect the young woman's death with the civil and criminal responsibility of the executives of Zopido S.A. This case is the maximum expression of institutionalized impunity. It was not a perfect crime. It was a crime committed in an environment so desolate and poorly supervised that its authors did not need to be geniuses, they only needed the rest of the world to be looking in another direction. The final slap to Gloria's memory occurred years later, when the building that housed the clinic was used as a set to film television comedies, including productions like Aquí no hay quien viva. It is a macabre metaphor, using as a backdrop of laughter the same place where, years ago, a 17-year-old young woman wrote with a twisted hand that she felt she was dying. This collective indifference, filming, laughing, and forgetting where there was an unresolved drama, is the definitive proof that, for the system, Gloria Martínez Ruiz ceased to be a person to become an anecdote that stood in the way of the official story. Gloria's case remains an open wound today. Her parents have fought for more than 3 decades, not for revenge, but for the truth. They have navigated the labyrinth of a judicial system that, in 1992, was not endowed with the forensic tools of today, and which at the time, preferred quick filing to complex investigation. The story of Gloria Martínez Ruiz reminds us that, sometimes, evil does not present itself with a mask, but with a white coat, a telephone note, and the complicit silence of those who, knowing what happened in that room, chose to remain silent so as not to lose their freedom.